But then, but of course, I was completely not impressed of the computer modeling, because we know that it's purely guesswork, and in fact it's worse than a computer game, because this is a game in which there's not much of a level of sophistication that they claim they have. I mean, there is no chance that for them to even present pick any type of cloud you want, please. Any type of cloud, name it, okay, that you can read in a standard meteorological textbook. That tell me which one have they represented the cloud in the system correctly. Just pick some part of the world ocean, see which part of it that they have presented it correctly. Pick any land surfaces that you want. Tell me which one have they done it correctly. So it is not even close to resemblance the reality that we have. And the problem with those powerful, here's a few simple points about climate model. Here's the problem that I have with them. Let me summarize it in maybe 1 or 2 points or 3 points. Even when you got it right, you got it for the wrong reason. Let's say that they always say, oh, we can do this well. We can calculate this global temperature. It looks so impressive. We can fit all of this, and it seems to agree with it. But I would say you know for sure you're going in that, because looking at your climate model, you didn't put in this, you put in that, you didn't put in that, and yet how come your result is looking the same like the what is measured? That's totally suspicious. Okay? And then most of the time, that they do, let's say in terms of I try to project the Earth system to the future. I mean, they know outright that they have not included all these other factors like ocean current or even how the sun would do. They have not included all of these key factors that we know that is working right now, and then they just simply chose to say that, well, we're going to turn off this because we're going to study only the CO2 effects, and the future and it's going to be driven by all of that. So this is where that is really fundamentally wrong with the climate models, because they are not even to the level of sophistication of tools that we know that would work properly. This is just not even close. I mean, computer game, you actually can get a sense of joy out of playing those computer games. But this one is just purely a black box that you kind of don't know what it actually does, and is going around in it, and you just spew out something, and okay, that's the truth. I mean, it's just ridiculous to try to think that the climate model could do all this work that people claim that it can do. It just simply cannot be.
Thank you for sharing that. It's extremely hypnotizing. It sold me. I'm sure it sold many people that unconsciously our environmental activists, advocates, people that are very concerned, good people bought it. I've been on a mission for 25 years, and part of my job is to stay receptive and to ask questions and to ask difficult questions to bring forth new answers and new directions for humanity. But the average person, once you buy in on something, it's very, very difficult to say, you know what, during this period of time, when I heard this, I bought it. But I've looked at facts, I've done an analysis of this, I've spent a lot of time on it, and I realized there's missing pieces, critical missing pieces that aren't even in the center of this focus that makes me retract, and now I'm in a different place.
That's very good. In fact, I do curious about how you really physically change your mind. I mean, I would just reiterate the example. I mean, for example, we know CO2 is a greenhouse gas, right? That one, no one would deny that, right?
Right.
And then we know that greenhouse gas will give this so-called warming effect, yes, because you have more of these changes of the energy budget that you can actually only add heat to the system, right? So, and then when you look at the real world data, and we know, for example, let's go back to the example of last 15 years or so, right? We know that this CO2 is rising, still rising rapidly, okay? It's going up, changes quite a bit, by the way, last 15 years. And when you look at the temperature data, and somehow this temperature data is not only not warming up, it's sort of showing a slow cooling tendency.
Yep.
Don't you think that you should really take a step back and take a deep breath instead of still be so committed to that blind faith that you actually have put in? I mean, some people are not able to step out of that. I don't know what is it about what we say here that is so offending to them. Some people would just quickly say, Willie soon, well, he's taking money from ExxonMobil, so on and so forth, that he could not be able to make any clear statement on science or things like that. I mean, I will give an example if we can. Still have time, we can talk about the polar bear example, that I've done research on polar bear. So on the issues, indeed, that people are saying you are discredited because you are taking money from ExxonMobil to do research. Well, I say, I've also taken money from National Science Foundation. I've also taken money from NASA. I've taken also money from United States Air Force. Does that mean that, which part of it that you think that I say is not true? This is where the issue has become very ad hominem and becoming senseless in a lot of ways. Objectivity is extremely important. Money could never ever buy a person like myself or David Legates, I can assure you. I know him long enough to know that money was never ever a factor. You know, our research has always been what you call curiosity-driven sort of a research that I'm sorry to say that most of it are sort of disappearing ever so gradually or rapidly. It depends on where you look, okay, in the field of studying this climate change. Because, I mean, maybe that Dave didn't emphasize the number. Over the last 15 or 20 years or so, we have spent almost $80 billion or more. In fact, some people estimate the number to be 100 billion or more over the whole globe. Of course, 80 billion belongs to the U.S. number. And we have spent that much of money. And this has become a very, very big money items in terms of all the university overhead money and so on and so forth. Even a free institution like a Harvard or all these places are no longer free because they are so tied to able to get a little bit more prestige, to get that much more of funding, to have this center for study of the earth environment, to be able to protect the earth environment, all in goodwill. But unfortunately, that part of it has becoming very tainted and very corrupted that they are unable to formulate simple questions to try to get at the real truth, which is really very unfortunate. I mean, now I want to speak on an example of some of the research that I've done on polar bear.
Can you hold 1 second about the polar bear?
Sure.
David, is there anything you want to add to that, to what he just said about the institutions and what's happening with regard to science and the funding of science?
I agree with everything he said. It's exactly right on.
All right, let's get to the polar bear. What is this thing about the polar bear on the ice?
Here's a thing that I've been sort of reluctant in the sense of trying to dive myself in terms of the full research, in terms of trying to understand the biology of polar bears, and there are other complexity that actually attracted me, of course, but it's the physical aspect of it, of course, of how ice really works and how the Arctic weather really changes and things like that. And ever since, I think, in 2005 or so, I've been contacted by a biologist, a polar bear biologist from somewhere in Nunavut, I believe. And he contacted me because he was very, very interested in how much information that I can pull in terms of trying to get the condition of the ice and the weather and the temperature, and historically too, of course, not only the current 50 years, for example. Let's say how far back can we go, maybe 1,000 years ago or so on and so forth. And we are focusing on the area called the Hudson Bay, the Western Hudson Bay, where indeed that this is the most well-studied polar bear population in the world. As we know, that polar bear has about 19 subpopulations in different parts of the Arctic, right? And this is one of the southernmost, almost the second southernmost part of the population. Indeed, that has been some sort of prediction or projection to say that if anything were to happen to the polar bear population, this southernmost population would be to feel it first. They would be able to detect it first. So this polar bear biologist contacted me, and his name is Marcus Dyck,
okay.
D-Y-C-K.
Okay.
And he was a very young biologist who's actually, I would say, even a few biologists who just go there and watch what the polar bear is doing. Actually, he's been hiding under something to look for study the polar bear behaviors. And he has other interests, of course. But here we are only trying to assess the questions about the true danger of the relationship of polar bear with the surrounding, right? And ice, of course, is one of the best connector there. So when I started to pull out all those data with help of also David Legates, we started to pull out all the temperature data, precipitation, rainfall data, and snowfall data, so on and so forth, around Western Hudson Bay. We look and look and look. We just couldn't find anything that is what you call alarming. For example, the whole proposition is that it's because the Earth is warming, so therefore it started to melt the ice earlier and earlier. So the ice started to melt earlier and earlier so that the polar bear could not sit on the ice, and so they had to come ashore earlier and earlier. So during springtime, of course, So this is what the proposition is.
Hold on one second. When you say this is what the proposition is, meaning this is what we're being told.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
The alarmists are proposing. They're essentially saying that as you warm, you melt the ice, and then essentially the more connection is that the spring ice are melting earlier and earlier, so that the polar bear has to come ashore earlier, so they get more and more hungry. In fact, the time they be able to spend is less and less on the ice floe, so they can get less access to the seal that they're supposed to eat, right?
Yeah, and by the way, I got sucked into this too. I was very sad. I looked at those pictures of the polar bears. I thought, oh my God. When you're an animal lover and you see something like that, I mean, I'm a sucker for that. I'm sure there's many.
Me too.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine a world without polar bear for sure. I mean, in my opinion. But the fact is that let's just try to find out the facts first. What are the truth about this situation? And then before we jump to the gun by saying that, well, by cutting CO2 emission, are we going to help this polar bear or what?
I agree.
That's what basically they're trying to propose. Unfortunately, again, I think polar bear has been used as that symbolism that they're trying to do. I mean, it's all about their cause, right? It's all about their whole idea instead of actually what the polar bear is actually doing, or would that really help the polar bear in the first place. So this is why I started to become very suspicious, so I started to research the issue. I learned so much about the polar bear itself, which I, of course, enjoyed doing that. Learning is one of the enjoyment, in my opinion. But then when I dig into this thing very deeply, I really just couldn't find those supporting evidence for those suggestions that you're going to kill this polar bear population because the globe is going to warm. And then I started to think more and more and more. And then I come up with actually my own original hypothesis, just like the question that I've been asking about ozone. The hypothesis that I have is indeed, the question is this. In fact, I come up with a statement first. I truly think that ice is perhaps the ultimate enemy for polar bear. It is a shocking conclusion in that sense. The shocking conclusion is because I started to ponder, what happened to the polar bear population during the last glacial maximum? Let's say the Hudson Bay area was completely ice covered. Where does the polar bear go? How do they survive until today?
That's a great question. I'd like to know.
During the warm time. First of all, thick ice means what? There'll be less biological activity. I mean, most of the oceans are covered with ice. They don't have a drill, so they don't know how to get access to this, drill a hole into the ocean where maybe the lower part of the ocean, Arctic Ocean, will still be warm, or Hudson Bay, where you can get access to the seal. So this is why I come up with the answer that ice is the ultimate enemy. Okay? Here's another extreme. If every single piece of the ice on Arctic melted away, and then sustained for, let's say, 50 years or 100 years, then of course, polar bear will go off. That's no doubt about that. That's all right. I agree with that. But the question is, what are the best conditions for polar bear itself? Or even better question to ask is that how many polar bear do you think we can sustain optimally?
Those are great questions.
Right. And I come up with an answer, actually. And I say that extreme ice is very bad, but polar bear really wants a condition in which that you have a lot of food, isn't it?
Yes.
And to have a lot of food, you really need the ocean to be very, very productive. That actually usually associated with less ice condition. And then productive to a point where, of course, not completely melted away, right? So what I conclude is that the weather and climate that we have today is not even close to the optimal condition for the polar bears. I measure that condition relative to, let's say, the medieval warm period, which we know the Vikings could live in Greenland, and they first went to Iceland, we know that, and went to Greenland. That's from about 800 AD to about 1200 AD or so, right? And this is how I measure that, okay? Because at that time, if you study even a bit of the Icelandic history, because they're very good at keeping record, right? You will see quite a few mention, by the way, of how, kids coming from Norway somehow, or Denmark even, come to Iceland and work very hard for years and years and years and save up all the money and then buy a polar bear, somehow go back into the journey and give it as a present to the king of Norway, for example. There's a story like that. There's all kinds of tales like that. This is one of the examples. But guess what happened? This is during the time of medieval warm period. And then during the Little Ice Age, where the Icelandic people are still keeping a lot of good record. In fact, they talk a lot about the sea ice is really encroaching on them, so on and so forth, right? You really barely find even that much of a mention of polar bears around, okay? I mean, that was my hypothesis. But I was just at least trying to tell you that if you think sensibly, absolutely no ice is bad. No one is doubting that. But then too much ice is really bad also for the polar bear itself.